Movie buff specialist Phil and John are back with another episode of our favorite 100 movies. We're all the way to number 83, episode number 18. I can't believe it's here either. We've, as crazy as this is, John, and I know that, whatever, we're 2 months away from half a year, which is kind of wild to think about. We've done 4 months of this. We've done 4 months of this. And I hope everybody who's been sticking with us since the beginning has enjoyed it. I know there's some of you who have been around since day one and seem to really like this. There's others who pop in and out here and there. But we've been going strong for 4 months. And finally, we're hitting a horror movie. I don't believe we've actually had a horror movie yet, unless there's one that I'm not remembering.
Depends how you classify The Wicker Man.
Yeah, that's more of like I guess that's a horror, but is that more of just like a suspense?
A suspense movie?
Yeah,
it's hard. This is our first very evident horror movie.
Yeah, this is our first, and without a doubt, this is our first modern horror movie because there's no arguing that one. Very much of the times of 2012 and what people were trying to do. But Blumhouse at the beginning of everything. We're talking about Sinister from 2012, and then we're going all the way back to the 50s, and we're talking 12 Angry Men from 1957, a movie that takes place almost entirely in one room. Unbelievable to think how that was pulled off. And yes, John, I am going to refer to them as juror 1 through 12 the entire time, and you better just be able to keep up with who is who.
It's okay. I wrote specific notes so that I could keep a track of who was who.
I love it. I love it. So 12 Angry Men, I'm very excited to talk about because the entire movie is about don't fall in to the group think BS, and do not be afraid to stand up to the mob if you feel that you are on your own. Don't feel afraid. Yeah. Can't wait to talk about that movie. Can't believe it came out in 1957. And no, we're not talking about the crappy William Friedkin remake. That was essentially just like a rehash of the same thing. Sinister with Ethan Hawke, 2012. John, I don't know which one of these. I guess Sinister's probably the more popular of the two, right?
Ooh, that's a tough question. Sinister's more kind of a culty classic, I think.
It's more modern, so people probably know it more now, but 12 Angry Men was on AFI's top 100 and everything. I don't know which one to start with. I'll let dealer's choice. John, you pick which one we start with.
Well, let's start with Sinister and round it off with 12 Angry Men today.
Okay, I feel like that's how, you could get this double feature. I don't know if you would be able to ever pull this off as a double feature, but we did it this week, and next week, this is just for everybody. Next week is my favorite double feature of all time. And I'm going to hint at it now or whatever, promote it now. The Room from 2003, the Tommy Wiseau movie, and La Notte, Michelangelo Antonioni movie that is just all about dread and just watch it. But those two movies being discussed in the same podcast only happens here on the Movie Buff Specialist. So make sure you're tuning in. That is going to be an absolutely ridiculous podcast. But let's start off with Sinister, John. Your number 83 and one of your top ranked horror movies. Why do you have it? Where you have it?
When it comes down to horror movies, and I've talked about this a little bit before, I am very much looking at atmosphere. If we look at the other horror movies I have further up my list, things like The Witch, Hereditary, Rosemary's Baby, they're all atmospheric horror movies. They play on an atmosphere and really build tension that way. Because to me, I don't want to be sitting there and just being jumped by a loud sting every couple of minutes when I watch a horror movie. That takes me out of the movie. I want to be so immersed in the movie that after a horror movie, I feel nothing but existential dread. And Sinister really kicked that off in 2012, I feel, and really helped build a foundation for the horror movies that have followed since.
Well, and this was Blumhouse really getting their start here. And I think that's what people, Blumhouse is they're the ones who make Get Out, and they make all of these big time horror movies now. Essentially, if you get a Blumhouse movie made, that's the best thing you can make. Or the best way you can get your horror movie made nowadays. So that's a really big deal. And this was kind of one of the ones that started it off on that trend. Now, I don't actually know which one was first and all of that. I don't really know the history of Blumhouse all that well. But I do know that this was a massive hit for them, and it ultimately led to the sequel, Sinister 2. But I do agree with you, John. I love atmospheric horror. The horror movies that I have on my list, or even movies that we'll just be watching as we go through, movies like The Descent and what was the other one that I was just looking at? Oh, Inland Empire, which might be a horror, might not be a horror, up to you. The Exorcist, Psycho, all of that. Psycho is one of the great jump scares of all time, one of the most terrifying scenes ever with that music coming in. But at the same time, that's what horror has now become. And I almost look at it as there was the time in the late 90s, early 2000s when people said voiceover is bad. But it was because voiceover was being used as a crutch. Goodfellas had amazing voiceover. A lot of movies had amazing voiceover, and a lot of movies that come out now still have amazing voiceover. But when it's being used as a crutch, that's different. And jump scares to me now are being used as a crutch. If you've ever seen The Exorcist 3, which, John, I know you haven't seen The Exorcist 1, but The Exorcist
I know
3,
of the scene in Exorcist 3.
Yeah, it has one of the great jump scares of all time. It is absolutely terrifying. It uses sound to perfection. But it's the only time it happens in the movie. And to me, the scariest part of Sinister is when he's walking through the house and that little girl's face just pops up right next to him and doesn't move. That's the scariest part to me, because why won't it go away? And to me, that's more unsettling than a jump scare. And, oh, look at that little thing. No, keeping it there. I always think about Mulholland Drive, the man behind Winkies. That scared the daylights out of me the first time I saw that movie. That's how I feel when it comes to Sinister. And that's when I think it's at its best, is when it's doing horror like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because Sinister isn't a movie that doesn't have jump scares. It has a few of them. It has them with that very loud sting, which, I mean, ever since cat people first introduced the sting, it's been a staple in horror movies. But a good jump scare needs to be set up, and it needs to lead to something. A jump scare can't just be an isolated incident, which is often what happens in some of these lesser horror movies over the past 3 decades.
Yeah, go ahead, keep going.
And Sinister was that turning point, I feel, because if we look at the horror movies that were coming out beforehand that were really popular, we were looking at like your Paranormal Activities, The Conjuring had just come out, Insidious had just come out. They were still very much leading into that like early aughts, late 90s type of styles of horror, with a lot of jump scares there just for the sake of a jump scare.
Yeah, and I really like The Conjuring. I think The Conjuring is a really well done movie. I actually probably prefer the first one to Sinister, but that's another one. Like, the one jump scare that stands out to me with The Conjuring is the one where she's on top of the armoire, and whatever happens there. Like, there's so many jump scares can work. They absolutely can work, but they need to be chosen. They need to happen at the right time. It can't be the only thing that's happening. And Sinister, it does have a couple of those, like, you know, all of a sudden you get the loud noise, or the kid in the box and he comes out of the box and he's bending over backwards. That's kind of creepy. There's a lot of really creepy moments throughout this movie. And you could call them jump scares, but it's never those, like I always think about when that girl's face shows up next to him. I don't even remember if there's a sound or not that happens.
Well, there certainly is. It's a very loud sound.
Okay, I just know that face terrifies me anyway, even without the sound. But I know that a loud noise is obviously going to get people to jump. It's the same reason if somebody beeps their horn at you, you jolt up, whatever it is. I mean, it doesn't really matter who you are. A loud noise is going to get you to jump. But jumping isn't the same thing as being scared. And the first time I saw Sinister, the ending, I jumped halfway to the ceiling when the face pops up at the end. But I watch it this time and it doesn't bother me at all, because I'm like, oh, that's what's coming. And honestly, it's not scary because we've seen this guy 85 times. So what's creepier is when it's him in the bush when he's looking at the picture. That's scarier to me, and that works better. And again, I think Sinister with the found footage element of it, without it being found footage, but still having the home videos and discovering it that way as a mystery, it just works so incredibly well.
Yeah, that's also one of the big things that draws me to this film is the presentation of the story in this film. Because you go in, and I mean, a lot of times in a film like this, when there are promotional materials for it, it kind of takes away from this film.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when Sinister came out in 2012. I didn't watch it because like the promotional material, I was like, okay, I know exactly what this movie is, and eventually got around to watching it, and it was completely different than what I thought it would be. Mm-hmm. And this is definitely a movie that if you haven't seen, it's so good going in cold and not knowing about, because it presents itself as just this mystery. What's going on? It feels like some of those other like mystery thrillers that we do have on this list. It even like has like 7 elements to it, right? And it's such a great way to present a horror movie, because that's not usually how a horror movie is presented. It's not presented as, hey, you're working with the character to solve everything that's going on. And then halfway through the film, when it just like flips to this supernatural horror movie and essentially a haunted house movie, it's such a logical change, but so meaningful at the same time that it really helps the film feel more elevated than some other films that were coming out before it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the classic horror movies, that's how they all kind of begin. It all begins with this mystery. The Exorcist is the mystery of what's going on with this girl. And we're trying to figure it out as they're trying to figure it out. And I remember when The Exorcist comes out, we hadn't seen exorcisms in every movie. Now every movie has to have an exorcism, and it's always crappy compared to what Friedkin did with The Exorcist. It never comes close. Conjuring might be the closest, but The Conjuring, that's the weakest part of the movie, in my opinion. Everything before that is scarier. And the thing is, there's a difference between just like body horror and psychological horror.
Yes.
And to me, the psychological horror always wins. And Sinister has so much psychological horror in it because we don't know, is he just drinking too much, not sleeping? What's going on with him in this movie that is making him feel the way he's feeling? And that is always better to me. Psycho is a psychological horror movie. The Exorcist is a psychological horror movie. The Descent, it even sets itself up as they go into this cave and then the monsters come, but the monsters come after everything's been scary for a long time. Yeah. That's Alien, psychological horror. And those are the types of movies that I will definitely go towards. Sinister is a psychological horror movie that towards the end starts to get a little bit more physical and things like that. But it is one of those movies that throughout you're like, is he seeing things? Who is this guy attacking with the hands on the body? That's always crazy. And Jordan Alford says The Babadook. That is also a very good one. And then it has that one moment in it that absolutely made me cry like a little baby. But did James Wan direct this? I think this was directed by Scott Derrickson, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. Okay. But anyway, that's what I have to say about the in terms of psychological horror. I do think that this movie, and I think a lot of Blumhouse movies that work, they pull from mystery first. Get Out, I don't really see as a horror movie. I see that more as like a thriller suspense movie. I don't see it as a horror. I don't really see it as a comedy either. So before people want to jump down my throat and say, you're, I remember at the time when that came out, people called it a comedy. People like went nuts. But I definitely think it's more of a thriller suspense movie than a horror movie, but it's still setting it up with what's the mystery. Think of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We don't know what they're going into. And once we're there, just seeing what they're involved with is scary enough. We don't need, oh, look, there was a face in the mirror or something like that. That doesn't do it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where this film starting off with the Super 8 footage of the murder that instigates Ellison and his family moving to this house in the first place is really clever, because it just hits you with the what is happening. What's going on, and you understand Allison's this crime writer and everything, and Ethan Hawke's performance in this is very good. And Ethan Hawke's an actor who I always appreciate it because he does seem very selective with his roles, so he needs to enjoy them. But his reactions to these Super 8 reels is phenomenal.
Yeah, and I think Ethan Hawke, I don't even know what I was about to call him. Ethan Hawke, though, I think he's a very underrated actor because people don't necessarily go out of their way to see his movies. I would say that Training Day and this are probably what people know him best for. If you're a sci-fi fan, you also know him for Gattaca. And if you're an older Robin Williams fan, maybe you know him for Dead Poets Society. But you're also not just like thinking, oh, Dead Poet Society, Ethan Hawke. No, you're thinking of Robin Williams, you know.
Yeah.
And if you think of Gattaca, you might be thinking of Jude Law and Uma Thurman more than you're even thinking of Ethan Hawke. But if you're a fan of the Before trilogy or these movies that he worked on with Richard Linklater, Boyhood, he likes to take those smaller roles and kind of work his way into them. So for him to take a leading role, because he's not really a leading man, despite the fact that he has the talent, doesn't necessarily have the look. He was always kind of like an odd looking guy, and not a bad looking guy, just doesn't have that chiseled jaw. Everything is perfectly aligned look. And so for him to take a lead role in a horror movie like this, he's normally not the lead, but then he's also normally doing smaller budget indie films. So he saw something in this, and I completely agree with you. I think it allowed him to kind of show off his acting chops to an audience that maybe had never seen his acting chops before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if you know this, but whenever we're seeing his reaction to a Super 8 film, it's his initial reaction.
That's good. See, that's also good.
So Derrickson didn't let him see the Super 8 films until they were filming the scenes where Ellison is discovering these films. So every reaction you see from him is just his raw reaction as a human being to these videos,
which I think is awesome. And I think sometimes like that also really works in horror. I know a lot of times, you know, that's what these directors will try to do, is they'll try to surprise them or just get them spooked, or even not in horror. That happens all the time. I always think of Derek Cianfrance with Blue Valentine, where he just told Ryan Gosling and Michelle Williams, when you get here, do your secret talents. He knew what the secret talents were, so he knew what he was about to film, but they didn't know. And so their reactions are authentic. And yeah, if you're watching these videos, I don't care if you know that it's filmed and it's for a movie or not, that lawnmower scene is absolutely grotesque. It's grotesque. It's awful. And even the ones I always like to think like, okay, normally a TV show has a writer's room. So they're sitting down saying, okay, how do we want to do this? You know, in the CSI, who are we going to kill him? How are we going to kill him this time? And I like to think like, there's not a writer's room for this movie. This is one guy writing the movie, or maybe two people writing the movie, but he's just sitting there going, what would be an interesting way to murder these people that we haven't really seen yet, that I could also give a clever name. And even the one at the end, what is it, painting the house or whatever it is, because they're all laying down on the plastic while she's chopping. Like, I just love the idea of Scott Derrickson sitting at home being like, so if I pull him in with cinder blocks on, like as he's like watching like his wife or something lay out in the sun, you know, like it's unbelievable what people will come up with when they're you know, doing whatever. I don't even know.
Yeah, and I love the use of Super 8 here. Super 8, especially at this point, like 2012, people kind of forgot. At that point, a lot of people who are going out to see horror movies at that point have never experienced a Super 8 film. Right? Of course, there's the J.J. Abrams movie of that name that have probably introduced most of the people to Super 8 film at that point. But the use of Super 8 film and having it be editable footage is just so clever, because it allows for that last twist at the very end of the film.
Yeah, and the last twist is so good, and I think there's also times, you know, when Blair Witch came out, everybody wanted to be Blair Witch. Everybody was just going to copy it. And even the first Paranormal Activity is okay, but you know, a lot of movies, like there was this movie Death of a Ghost Hunter that Blockbuster had like 30 copies of for some reason. I remember watching that, and like totally entertaining, terrible acting, all of that nonsense. But it's like, why did it have to be handheld footage? Everybody just wanted to be handheld, found footage, all that's going to add to the fear. This movie, it actually does add to the fear, because you're also saying to yourself, who the hell's filming this? And that's what the question he keeps asking all the time. Who's filming this? Where's the kid? But you don't think it's the guy filming it because he's there. But then also the first time we see him, he's standing under the water. How is he standing under the water? And he's turning and staring right pretty much seemingly at Ethan Hawke. I think the found footage in this movie really, really elevates it. It's a stylistic choice that also makes sense. And because it's that Super 8 creepy film that moves a little bit faster and everything's a little bit off and you can't really see everything, it's not high definition. It does add an element of eeriness to it. It just does.
Yeah, and it also it translates to the scene we were talking about with the girl's face, and where we're seeing the ghost kids throughout the house, because the way they're moving is very choppy, and it's very Super 8 like in their movements, and it's just so stylistic of a choice for this horror movie that, when you get down to it, it's a pretty simple plot. You explain it to everyone. Okay, it's a pagan deity instead of actual ghosts, but it's a simple plot. It's the same plot we've heard for many movies beforehand, but it just has the stylistic choices to it that helps differentiate it from everything else.
Yeah, there's a uniqueness to it, and even like bringing in, I guess it's Vincent D'Onofrio, right? I believe it's Vincent D'Onofrio who plays like the professor from the university or whatever. Even bringing him in, it's not the scene of, every single horror movie that's come out since 1973 that involves anything with paganism or anything. Oh, here is the scene where they're going to call the priest and he's going to come sit in the house and they're going to have a boring conversation that we've heard in every other movie about this house is haunted. What do we do? It's every movie. It's every single one of them. But this is different because we don't actually, like, you almost get a creepy feeling from him, even though he never has any ill intentions the entire movie, but you get a creepy feeling from him that, like, we don't see him. What does he know about this guy? Is he in on it somehow? Same thing with the deputy. You're thinking the whole time, is he in on this? What is going on here? And he's not in. Nobody's actually in on anything. Nobody's trying to get one over on Ethan Hawke in this movie. It's just a spirit pagan type thing that people in other, like, in the general way that these types of horror movies go, there would be more of a behind the scenes. Oh, well, we're all praying to him. So that doesn't necessarily make things creepier. It works in some cases, like The House of the Devil, the Ty West movie, or something like that. But I also think that this movie made it a little bit more possible because it wasn't all jump scares and things like that. And it was more of score and taking its time and getting into it for movies that are smaller budget, indie horror movies, but like It Follows or The Babadook or The House of the Devil. And I think all of those came out after this one. And I think that this was kind of that transition from the crappy Omen remake that came out in 2006 and every bad movie that came out after that to, okay, we can mellow out a little bit and still scare the crap out of people.
Yeah. And I'm really glad you mentioned the score, because the score for this movie is incredibly haunting. It's almost inexplicably haunting. And when it just kicks up, something's going to come. And that is another thing this film does so well. It plays on horror tropes so well to trick its audience. There are so many scenes where you'll get that fuzzy background and there's the focus on the two characters, but they're not centered. They're off to the side, and you're like, oh, there's totally going to be something that comes up behind them here. And it just never happens.
And the one scene where it does happen is when the kids are running around him, but it's all silent. They're not making loud noises. It's not meant to make you jump. It's just meant to be like, are they watching him? What are they going to do? And then they run off to the side. And they're always trying to get away before he turns. I think that's a really interesting, like, approach to this, because it's not one we see very often. I always think that David Lynch is so popular because, one, he's weird as hell, but two, he knows how to create a feeling. He knows how to create an atmosphere. And when you watch a Lynch movie, you're unsettled the entire time because he wants you to be unsettled. And he knows that he can unsettle you by lingering and staying on it and having it be silent and having the person barely move. That freaking blue box with the old people in Mulholland Drive is absolutely horrifying. And there's a scene in Inland Empire where there's a clown face. And I remember my friend was like, just pause it. I don't know if I can finish this movie. Like, it's so ridiculous. But that's what Sinister's doing here is you're waiting for something that's not coming, but that anticipation is more than enough to make you scared for what's going to happen. And when it doesn't happen, it's almost scarier because you're like, well, why didn't it happen? And when is it going to happen? When are these kids going to turn on him and start murdering him or whatever they're going to do? And the scene where the kids are all sitting there staring is top notch. Love that.
Yes. Yeah. It's that anticipation is just so big. And then, because like you said, you don't even get a sense of relief when nothing happens, because you're just wondering what's happened next. After he's walking around the house and the kids are all dancing around him and stuff, he sits down in that living room and you're like, what's going to happen? Something has to happen here. That this is obvious. Like, the glass is going to break in at him and somebody's going to come grab him or something. And then he just wakes up in the morning.
Yep.
Like, it's so well executed in what it manages to do of creating the atmosphere to leave you terrified the entire time. And because it never has that great payoff, it just keeps building on itself to make you more scared and more scared until you get to the incredibly disturbing ending.
Yeah. And I, again, disturbing to me always works better. Like, I think about, what we've talked about mainly is the score, the Super 8 footage, the choices that were made. Think about the beginning of this movie, like you were talking about, where it's that you actually see the murder take place with everybody being hung. And so as that's happening, it's on Super 8 footage, which there's no sound on that footage. You need actual sound recording. It's not like this where we're just getting sound anyway. There's no sound. So you're just getting kind of that weird clicking sound with that ominous just tones as this tree is being sawed. And all of those stylistic choices have a meaning and have a purpose in this movie. And that is one of the things that I really credit this movie for. I was really surprised it was on your top 100, but I do remember that when I first watched this back in probably 2013, 2014, somewhere around there, I remember being really surprised how much I enjoyed it. Because I thought it was just going to be another one of those crappy horror movies. Like you said, you watch the trailer and it's like, but I think there's a lot of thought that went into this movie. And as I said, it paves the way for a lot of really good ones. There were always going to be low budget horror. Low budget horror is kind of what it is. But this was kind of paving the way for, hey, you can still make an intelligent movie with an almost A-list actor, bunch of other unknowns, keep it as a haunted house type movie without it really being a haunted house movie, and have a compelling story told in a unique way. And Blumhouse started to do that. I mean, that's why Us and Get Out and I know they did Ma, which was friggin' stupid, but at least it was like unique, even though it was dumb. They do a pretty good job of trying to up it every time and not just fall into this trope of every other horror movie.
Yeah. And that's what's nice about this, because it does still have those elements of horror movies. Despite the fact that we're talking about subverting the expectations based on horror tropes, at the end, this is a movie about pride, right? And when you look at most horror movies, they almost always there's Randy's speech in Scream where he's talking about the rules of horror movies, and he's talking about the sins, right? And how, like, in slasher flicks, you're looking at the lust, but throughout horror movies, there's almost always a sin playing into the people who are being victimized in them. And in this case, it's pride. Ellison's pride is what took him there in the first place and put them in this situation. It was his pride that didn't result in him calling the cops as soon as he found evidence of another murder. And he just wanted that pride and that self-satisfaction. Even at the end, when his daughter is murdering him, she says, "Don't worry, Daddy, I'll make you famous again." Yep.
Because that's what he wants. He wants that Kentucky blood again. That's what he's striving for. And he's so desperate. He's actually moved his family into the house this time.
Yeah. It's so interesting how this movie takes those classic horror tropes, presents them for us, and knows when to actually use them and when to subvert them. And that's what this movie does differently than the movies that preceded it in the decade beforehand.
Yeah. I do agree. I agree with you. I agree. The aughts were not a good decade for horror. The Descent is a masterpiece as far as I'm concerned, but other than that, not a good decade for horror. I think the 2010s really started to pick it up because they really started to change the game a little bit. I didn't realize the Babadook and It Follows both came out in 2014. If you haven't seen the Babadook and It Follows, do yourself a favor and check those movies out. Both of them are slow. Both of them are slow burn type horror. You got to kind of buy into that. And I know a lot of people don't. A lot of people now, they have kind of been trained to, if I'm not scared in the first 5 seconds, I don't care. But The Witch and Hereditary and, oh God, what was the other one that I didn't even really like? But Midsummer. I didn't even really like Midsummer, but Midsummer's got some really freaking creepy parts to it where you're like, oh my God. So it opened the door for this, and It Follows, as you were talking about with the sin. It's all a metaphor for just STDs. I mean, that's all it is, but it's so well done in execution. Horror movies, it's all about execution, because at this point we have seen everything that could possibly scare us. We have seen it all. but how are you going to execute it to make me more scared than I was the last time? How are you going to do a home invasion movie that is making me more scared than Halloween or than the Strangers or something like that? How are you going to do a movie about a ghost that's going to scare me more than movies that came out before, than The Omen or Burn Offerings or something? How are you going to do that? I think Sinister does a pretty good job at figuring out a unique way to just unsettle you the entire movie and leave you after it cuts to black going, shit, like I don't feel good right now.
Yeah, and that exact feeling is why we have that final jump scare in the movie too.
Mm-hmm.
When they showed Sinister to test audiences, they were too unsettled when they just left with the kids there at the very end.
But it's so much better.
They were too unsettled. So I know that's the type of ending you and I appreciate, Phil. But test audiences were like, no, it's not good because of this ending. So the studio was like, we had to put in this last jump scare in order to break the audience away and make them realize, oh yeah, right, it's just a movie. It's okay.
Yeah. And like I said, the first time it made me jump, but this time watching it, it didn't really do anything for me. But yeah, I'm happy you included Sinister. It wouldn't be on my top 100. It's just like not my type that ends up around here, but definitely a good horror movie to check out, and one of the few that deserves a sequel and that deserves the praise it gets and deserves to be seen by, there's a lot of horror movies out there that are just a complete waste of time, but what was it, Fear.com, or what was the One Missed Call? That's the one Missed Call. That should be in your top 100, John. But yes, it's fun to talk modern horror, because if you haven't watched modern horror in a long time, we're getting to the summer. It's like the time of the year where you can get away with it and like not be too scared. But, then all of a sudden you start getting into those fall months, start thinking about some of these modern horror movies if you haven't seen them, because they're really all worth checking out.
Yeah. And if we're being honest, like, I hope you guys do like horror movies, because after COVID, you're going to see a lot more of them because they're cheap to make.
Yeah, they're the cheapest thing in the world. That's all it takes. And
they make a ton of money
when done right.
Yeah.
When done right. They have the biggest low risk, high reward type payoff. I mean, that's Blair Witch, Paranormal Activity. These movies were made for nothing. The three people who did Blair Witch have done nothing ever. And they have so much money, it's insane. They have so much money, it's insane, just because of one movie. That's what happens. All right, John, before we get to 12 Angry Men, what was the best thing you watched this past week?
Apparently, I'm just doing some Jordan Alford fan service here, but it was West Side Story.
I just can't believe you haven't seen it. I saw that you had reviewed it on Letterboxd, and I just couldn't believe you hadn't watched it until then.
It's one of those things. I definitely watched it as a kid, but I hadn't gotten to the point where I could appreciate it. I couldn't appreciate a score by Leonard Bernstein. I couldn't appreciate lyrics by Stephen Sondheim. I couldn't appreciate the fact that it's a modern, at the time, modern retelling of Romeo and Juliet. Mm-hmm. Right? And so now that I finally had that, it was great watching it. And the music in the movie is absolutely impeccable. It's Bernstein. He's one of the great American composers. There was no question that the music was going to be good in this. Mm-hmm. And I'm a huge, huge Shakespeare nerd. So I love the fact that it's just Romeo and Juliet. And I love the updating of it and the slight changes to it. So it's not clearly Romeo and Juliet, but it's Romeo and Juliet. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I will say this. It's really weird watching that movie as a Twin Peaks fan.
Because of Russ Tamblyn?
Because of Russ Tamblyn and...
who's the other one who's in it?
Richard...
oh, yeah. I know what you're talking about. I can't think of his name.
Because Tony's Ben Horn and
yes.
Riff is Dr. Jacoby. And you're just watching this movie. It's like, these are so obviously these two people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I totally forgot. I couldn't think... I always forget about Ben Horn because he was barely in the... mm-hmm. The whatever, the one that you like that I don't. Yeah. But yeah, no, I'm glad you finally watched West Side Story. That's definitely worth checking out for anybody who hasn't seen West Side Story. If you've been living under a rock like Sir John over here, who is doing a movie podcast and hadn't seen West Side Story, I was kind of tied between two. So there's two I want to mention, and then I'm going to go with one here. But last night I watched Brief Encounter, which is a David Lean movie based on No Coward play with one act players out. Great movie about just an affair. And it's so great to see David Lean do a movie like so small, being that he's known for Lawrence of Arabia and The Bridge on the River Kwai and Dr. Zhivago, like arguably the greatest epic director of all time. And he comes out and he makes this really small movie. But I think I got to go Moulin Rouge. I'd never seen Moulin Rouge. And that was one of the weirdest. It's so funny because last week we talked about Delicatessen. I watched that with my fiance. She goes, that movie was too weird. But then she's the one who owns Moulin Rouge and was like, oh, I want to watch that. And every time someone had me go, oh, yeah, and Delicatessen was too weird. Delicatessen was too weird. Because it's an absolutely bizarre movie. But Baz Luhrmann, when he's in control, man, only he can pull off what Baz Luhrmann pulls off. And I don't know, Jim Broadbent singing Like a Virgin and then Richard Roxburgh kind of coming on to him a little bit there. One of the funniest scenes ever. And it just, that movie has such a high energy level and it doesn't let up the entire time. It's a good watch. And it was one that, not that I had put it off, but it just like, it never had come. Like I'd always wanted to see it. And it really did surpass my expectations. And it made me hate A Beautiful Mind even more than I already hate A Beautiful Mind. One of my least favorite movies of all time, what I believe is one of the worst 3 or 4 best picture winners ever. And then I start looking, like every time I watch a movie from 2001, I go, oh my God, you've got to be kidding me. And Baz Luhrmann wasn't even nominated for Best Director that year so that we could give Ron Howard an Oscar for being Opie in whatever show he was in. So I don't know. That's all I got. I like Great Gatsby, Jordan. Australia is stupid. But anyway, let's go to 12 Angry Men, a movie that is nothing like Moulin Rouge or Sinister or West Side Story or any of those movies. This is a small budget, pretty much nothing movie. This movie should not work. This movie should be boring. This movie should drive you nuts that it's an hour and a half of just people talking. But oh my God, does this movie work? And every time I watch it, I get amped about it every single time. Like as they're figuring this out, how can you possibly have a movie about 12 people who are on a jury that we didn't even see what the case was. We didn't even know what the case was. We just have that one shot of the kid's face, and we just know he's a young kid who's also a minority. That's all we know. That is all we know. And these 12 men go into this room. How do you make a movie that good? And it's just all about writing. It's just all writing. It's all acting. It's an acting. It's a master's class in both of those. It's just a master class in both. And you have some of the great actors of all time: Lee J. Cobb, Henry Fonda, Harry Balsam, Martin Balsam, couldn't think of his name, E.G. Marshall, Jack Warden, Jack Klugman. You just go right down this line. It's just impeccable actor after impeccable actor after impeccable actor. And as we were talking about horror movies, Martin Balsam and Lee J. Cobb go on to play 2 detectives in 2 of the great horror movies ever made, The Exorcist and Psycho. So there you go. And they're jurors number 1 and 3 for anybody who's keeping track at home with the numbers. But I love 12 Angry Men. 12 Angry Men is a timeless movie with a timeless message. And that message is, if you're outnumbered a lot to a little, have the conversation anyway. It's worth having the conversation because you never know what prejudice is, what just distorted beliefs. You never know if somebody just has baseball tickets and they want to go to the game and don't really give a shit because they're never going to think about this kid again. You never know. And I think in an era like 2021 and what 2020 was, which was just a total nightmare of a year between COVID and COVID deniers and COVID, like people who believed COVID almost like to the point where it's going to wipe out the population, and Trump versus Biden and all of that stuff, have the conversation because more often than not, you're going to find common ground. Even as social media and things like that are doing everything they possibly can to tear us apart. Every day that I go on my freaking Twitter, it is just Death Santis is trending because I live in Florida. I have said not interested on that every single time, and yet it pops up every single day. That doesn't mean I like DeSantis or dislike DeSantis. It just means I don't want to see that because it's all negative. And like I said, I think that if you don't go for these what's trending and all of that, you can find middle ground. one of the best lines ever. And John, I swear you're about to talk. I swear. One of the best lines ever. He can't hear you. He never will. And yes, there are people that it's not worth having the discussion with. But for the most part, if you're in a room of 12, there's probably going to be 9 of them who are willing to listen. They just might take some convincing. And yet it's not about, what I think is amazing is this movie is not about Henry Fonda trying to convince the others. It's him just saying, think about it before we come to this decision.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the most important things about juror number 8 is that he's not even saying that the kid's innocent at the beginning of the movie. He just says, we need to take some time to talk about this because we literally hold someone's life in our hand right now.
Mm-hmm. And I think people, I've never been on a jury, so I don't know. But I think people have a way of kind of minimizing the effects on others that certain actions take. And, it's the same thing as like when you do see stuff trending or whatever, or when people start digging up tweets from 25 years ago of somebody quoting a song and now they're getting kicked out of whatever. Or I always think about the kid from Villanova when he hit the game-winning 3. And then it was like, how can we go find his Twitter and just like blow up his life? Like, screw that guy. We hate him. You don't realize how damaging that kind of stuff can be. And I think this movie does a really good job of, there's 11 men in that room where 6 or 7 of them might be like, yo, what I heard, he was guilty. But they're all so ready to just be like, let's ruin this kid's life because forget him. I have other things to do right now. And almost not even taking into account that this would put him in jail. He would be executed for this. Not even thinking about that because they're not the ones being executed. So what do they care? And for juror number 8 to just say, well, let's just talk for a couple minutes. And then you start getting the arguments of, well, what could we possibly talk about? There's nothing to talk. He's guilty. He's guilty, blah, blah, blah. But it's just the idea of, well, let's just think about it. It doesn't make sense. And by the end of this, it's 100%. Like, he probably didn't do it. And if he did, okay, but he probably didn't. And you definitely can't say he definitely did.
Yeah. And as the plot goes on, we do find out juror number 8 does have reasons behind his doubt. Specifically when he pulls out the switchblade that was supposedly unique, and it was very much not unique. But he's just sitting there as someone who's wants to encourage conversation. And like you said, it's incredibly relevant even in today's world, especially in a world where social media tries dividing us based on our opinions a lot. And the content we see all the time is supportive of our opinions rather than opposing our opinions. So even now, this movie from 54 years ago is incredibly relevant, even on the same topics it was already talking about prejudice and about critical thinking and mob mentality. They're so relevant today, which means not enough people have watched this movie and learned from it.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem. Jordan said it's number 6 on his top 100, and like, this is a movie, like, every time I watch it, I'm more impressed by it because it is such a small movie. And I even I always love, there was the rumor in Survivor 38, right, that somebody had said the N-word. That was what the rumor was. So what does everybody immediately do? Well, who do you think said it? Oh, I bet you it was this person. Oh, it had to have been that person. Why? Because they're from this part of the country, or they've acknowledged that they voted this way or whatever it was. And I love when the vote switches and the juror number 8 doesn't vote. And everybody else votes in secret, and it's guilty, 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 guilty. And it just seems like, great, we're out of here. And he says, if one of you changes, we sit down and talk. And somebody changes, and they immediately jump on juror number 5. And it had to have been him. What's wrong with you? You were mad at us because we said you were poor, blah, blah, blah. And it turns out he voted guilty. It was juror number 9 who voted not guilty. And I think when you start to look at that, and that's how we are still. And it's sad because people just can't turn it off. People, they want to assume based on the limited information they could possibly have. And I think now it's so easy to assume and also damage with how simple it is to just send out a tweet that's like, I bet you it was this person. Well, once you put that out there, people can just hop on and say, oh, well, it was I saw that and that must have been it, and not even do any research on it. And this movie shows that 64 years later, whatever it is, we still have not gotten past that of just assuming based on limited knowledge because it's easier.
Yeah. In fact, it might be worse now because it's so easy. People feel like they don't need to look up knowledge now, despite the fact that we're living in an age where if someone has an opinion on something, you can literally Google things in the palm of your hand in an instant that refute whatever opinion they have, whether it's correct or not. Like, we have that ability, but people are so take it for granted so much that they're not even willing to think about anything and try to have that conversation anymore. Because yes, you can look up the information, but what's the point? Because I'm always right and you're always wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that becomes a very serious problem. And in this movie, it shows what the power of one person really can be, of just one person standing up. And then juror number 9 says, well, my reasoning is I'm not convinced. Again, I'm not convinced you're right, number 8. But you took a chance there. And for you to be willing to take that chance, I might as well hear you out because there's clearly something going on in your mind. And then you got the guys playing tic-tac-toe and all of that stuff. And how are you going to convince? There's certain people, like I always find it interesting. Juror number 1, we almost don't understand what his beliefs are the entire movie. We don't get his anything going on there. He keeps it quiet. He just kind of keeps voting guilty, guilty, guilty. And we're like, but we're just like, great, he's going to vote guilty. But we still hate Lee J. Cobb's character more, or hate Ed Begley's character, which he is friggin' phenomenal in this movie. And it also goes to show, though, when he starts being he's being racist from the start and people are calling him out on it, but when he's overtly racist and every single person just gets up from the table and just ignores him like he's not even there. I mean, it also shows what the power of the mob can do when it's actually going against somebody who really deserves to be gone against, as opposed to, they're silencing somebody who deserves to be silenced. Or at the beginning of the movie, they're all ready to silence juror number 8 and just pretty much say, oh, screw you, we're going to have a hung jury then, without even trying to convince him or get him to convince. And when he says, oh, well, the 11, I think it's Martin Balsam, the juror number 1 says, well, why don't the 11 of us try to convince him? And it's like, well, why doesn't he try to convince us? We're already here. That's the differing mentality. Well, obviously the one person is who you're trying to convince because you guys already know he shouldn't be trying to convince all 11 of you at one time.
Yeah, exactly. And when you look at this film, it's very interesting because it very much skims over the fact for a large portion of the movie of the idea of innocent or you're only guilty if it's beyond a reasonable doubt. And that when they do finally bring it up, juror number 11 just quips, do you understand what this phrase actually means? It's just those little things in this movie and the writing in it. And the writers were so meticulous with exactly which of these 12 men said which line.
Oh, yeah. And that's something I noticed too. And for anybody out there who wants to be a screenwriter or a writer, or any type of writing, or just loves writing, think about any movie you've ever seen where there are 12 characters in a room anyway. And I'm not talking about extras. I'm talking about The Godfather, when they're at the wedding and the entire family, Diane Keaton, every single one of them is there. But they're not even all next to each other at this point. Find me another movie that has 12 characters who could have a line at any time. It's very hard to do. Now think about how this movie, like you said, John, every single one of these lines is developing a character. is developing what they believe, or if they're changing or whatever. I never sweat. Just E.G. Marshall saying, I never sweat. And then 2 seconds later, he's got the bead of sweat dripping down his head. I guess he does sweat. Or juror number 2, he's kind of like the mousy, nervous guy. Every line he has, every line. Lee J. Cobb keeps repeating himself. Juror number 3. But this is so purposeful because that's the argument this guy would make. He doesn't have a leg to stand on, and he never did, but there's something that happened in his past with his kid that he sees in this guy that he cannot get over. And therefore, he's just going to keep saying guilty, guilty, guilty. You have the guy who he wants to go to the ball game. He's got to go to the ball game. And then finally, when he does change his vote, he doesn't even give a reason. Oh, I just, you like, and a guy who's agreeing with him, who is on the not guilty side, juror 11, I think it is, says to him, you can't just change for no reason. Explain it. And he won't do it because he literally can't do it. Every line of dialogue in this movie plays a role in the overall movie.
And it all starts from the very beginning of the film, because the first few lines before they're even discussing the case at all, they establish each of these characters incredibly quickly in this movie. You know, in the first 5 minutes of this film, exactly how each of these characters is going to act throughout the entire film.
Yeah. And they never break from what they are. I mean, even, it's the ad executive. He doesn't really care. And the entire time he doesn't really care. And then he switches back. He's the only one who actually switches his vote back and forth. And then he switches back. And then with the glasses, he immediately goes, all right, not guilty. But he's the only one who kind of is wishy-washy because he's so aloof. He doesn't care. He doesn't want to be there. And then you have juror 8 and juror 9 who are kind of like paired off together just because. But I just, 7 and 3 are going to do what they do. It's so well done right from the beginning. And I don't know. I mean, it's incredible to think because nothing's ever come close to this, in my opinion, in terms of there's really no score. There's no action. There's nothing else. It's just a movie, and it's shot, and it keeps going through the mystery in a really unique way.
Yeah, and it's essentially just a stage play.
Yeah,
this is exactly. I mean, it's an hour and a half, right? So it's a short stage play. It's something that could easily be done on stage, and it doesn't really change the tone of the film at all. And that's how the writing and acting really shine through in this, because it doesn't have that score. It doesn't have a bunch of tricky camera angles or fantastic shots or anything. It's so condensed that it just focuses on what it does well. And that's why it shines through. And that's why we're still talking about it 54 years later.
Yeah, because there's a lot of movies that are based on stage plays or that try to do this, set it in one location. Or I think about there was the Roman Polanski movie with John C. Reilly and Kate Winslet and Christoph Waltz. I can't think of the name of it, but it wasn't really much going on in that movie. It's just very much like, it doesn't feel inspired to be cinema. And like this movie, even though it's all very small and it's all in one location and you could see it as a play where 12 people just never leave stage, it's still meant to be a movie. And you can tell that this version had to be a movie. There are theatrical, not theatrical, but there's film going elements to it that aren't there in the theater. I don't know what the word is there. Cinematic quality. Thank you. There are cinematic qualities to this movie. And there's a lot of cinematic qualities from the shots, the angles from below going up. I mean, there's so many well done shots. And what's crazy to me is this movie was nominated for picture. It was nominated for screenplay, and I believe it was nominated for director. And that was it. And granted, Bridge on the River Kwai wins Best Picture that year at the Oscars. Totally deserving. Even if I like this movie more, Bridge on the River Kwai deserved it. Bridge on the River Kwai did not deserve to win Best Screenplay over this, though. I will say that. Great screenplay, but this could be one of the top 5 screenplays ever written because of, you think about where you start, where it's 11-1. And then you think, okay, if you were to sit down and write this movie, John, You now we're 10 minutes into the movie. It's 11:01. How do you get another hour and 27 minutes out of that without them ever leaving this room other than to go into the bathroom very briefly and still make it compelling every time and make it so that every time we're getting new information, it feels unique and feels worthwhile and we don't feel like we're just kind of running in circles? How do you do that? That is an impossible task. It's impossible.
Well, it's impossible now that we've already seen the groundwork for it because it's already there. Yeah. Somebody's already finished it. But no, if you just have a layman out there and say, okay, one person thinks he's not guilty, make it so that all of them think he's not guilty, it's never going to be this good. Mm-hmm. It's never going to be written in such a logical way. And that's one of the things that's really nice about this plot is that you start with juror number 8. I'm not saying he's not guilty, but I'm just saying we need to talk about it. And then juror number 9 jumping on because it's like, you know what? If this man's willing to take the risk, then we owe him that much. Mm-hmm. And then the evidence starts coming out. And then they start scrutinizing everything. And every little bit that comes out, another person or two is convinced of the person's innocence. And it's really interesting because there's no action in this movie at all. Mm-hmm. We don't even see the inciting incident in this film. But it's laid out in such a way that you really do visualize the exact inciting incident. Yeah.
Well, and that was going to be something I was going to say. This movie almost starts to have the feel of a of like a Poseidon Adventure type movie where like every time you hit an obstacle, somebody dies, except it's the opposite where every time evidence comes up, somebody changes their mind. Mm-hmm. But everything feels so earned. It's not, let's just have a random electrocution. When they're talking, we're all set up at the beginning. It killed them. And there's this, the woman's solid, and the old man, his testimony, blah, blah. And then it starts to be, okay, well, give us a diagram of that room. Let me see what that room would have looked like. Okay, let's try to walk it. You even said he walked with a limp. Or the I'll kill you stuff. And then Lee J. Cobb says, I'll kill you later in the movie. Or the woman with the train passing. That's the last one, and that's always my favorite. How are you going to convince these last people? And he says, what about this? It has to be. I mean, you have those dimples. They're probably uncomfortable. Why would she put them on just as the last thing? She didn't see it. She thinks she saw it. And even for characters that aren't in the movie, the old man and that woman who aren't even in the movie, we understand their motivations because it's being drawn out for us by the jurors who are saying, well, maybe he just wants to be famous for a time. He's never been famous before. He's an old man who's proud and wants this and wants that. Blah, blah. Very fascinating stuff. It's very, very fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really just dives into the human psychology and the human mind a lot and how it works, how it processes information, how it jumps to conclusions and fills in information when there is information missing. Mm-hmm. And at the same time is very hypercritical of the justice system because we talked about it in The Hunt, right? When the guy comes in and starts asking the leading questions. Mm-hmm. And in this case, we really have these witnesses kind of corroborating each other's stories because they've had that little bit, enough detail put in that they can kind of agree with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm just so go ahead. I'm distracted because I'm thinking of like when this was being directed by Sidney Lumet. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of like not really off of what you were saying. That's why I was like, well, do I bring this up now or do I not? But it's kind of like he was trying to make us the fly on the wall. Like we're the 13th juror. And at the beginning, we're like, all right, well, put yourself in that room. You'd probably be annoyed on this super hot freaking day in New York where the fan doesn't even work and the window's barely open. And you'd probably be annoyed too that this one guy is doing that. Which juror do you see yourself as? Like, it's almost like either you see yourself as a juror or when did you become convinced? Do you know what I mean? And I feel like that's what Lumet was trying to do with this movie. And I think he does it impeccably.
Yeah. It's almost a thought experiment.
Yeah.
right? Of, okay, if you're in this situation, you're being presented the evidence. What do you think?
Mm-hmm.
And this is without any of the like thought process and deliberation that the jurors are having. You have to just go off the information that's being presented at this point, where the woman was in her bed, she rolled over through the last two cars of the L train, saw that he stabbed him.
Mm-hmm.
Or the old man was in his bed, he heard a thud on the floor, got up to his door, saw him running down the stairs.
Mm-hmm.
And we're presented with this information, and then we're presented with the counter arguments to it. And it's really interesting to think, which juror are you in this? And everyone you ask that is going to say, oh, I'd totally be juror number 8.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are just juror number 7.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, is that a lot of people are juror number 7. They just like to pretend they're juror number 8. And I wonder if there was a reasoning for the positioning of these people. You know what I mean? Where like juror number 7 being so close to juror number 8, but being so far away from juror number 8 in reality, because juror number 8 is taking this very seriously. Juror number 7's the kind of guy who in modern terms would go on Twitter, see what's trending, throw out a tweet and hope he got likes by putting in that trending topic.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if there's a hashtag, he throws in the hashtag and sees what he can get and hopes he gets attention. And if he doesn't, whatever, he doesn't really care who he hurts or anything like that. But I think, you know, Jordan Alford just said it here. I think most people are probably, if you are somebody who's like a good person like that, I think you would be number 9, because do you have the courage to be the first one to stand up, or are you the person who says, you know what, I'll hear you out. Let's see what happens here. And I like to think that I would have been number 9 to give it another chance. I like to think that, but there's a part of me too that might be, well, maybe I'm number 5 and maybe I would have needed more convincing. We also don't know what they were told when they were in the courthouse, where it seems like the defendant had a horrible, horrible attorney.
Mm-hmm. And that's where it kind of plays into this idea that it is criticizing the justice system at the same time. Mm-hmm. But I like the fact that it's not just, oh, he did want to be there. They even broke down logically why his attorney wouldn't be there.
Yep.
Wouldn't want to be there. It's because it wasn't this big... a lot of it just came down to attention in this movie. Mm-hmm. It's like, this isn't going to make him prolific. He's a young lawyer who, it's probably one of his first cases. He's just public defending this person, and getting him off isn't going to get him anywhere in his career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's, they even say, what is it? Like, it's a dead job. Like, it's not going to do anything.
Yeah. And a lot of people are probably juror number 9, but even juror number 9 is a tough one to be, because when you're in a crowd and in a mob, the leader isn't the most important person. Mm-hmm. The most important person is the first follower. Juror number 9 is literally the most important person to this entire trial.
Yeah, absolutely. Because without juror number 9, whatever juror number 8 said before that doesn't matter anyway. And that's the truth. And I love, like, when you start to get to this, I'd like to change my vote to not guilty. I love when they start to come to that realization. But we don't know. Is it because they didn't have the courage to say it originally, or did they really think, no, this guy's guilty and he's just wasting my time? We don't really know what the reasoning is.
Well, and we even see it in the opening vote. Mm-hmm. In the very first vote, when they're like, okay, who thinks he's guilty? Mm-hmm. If you watch whose hands go up, mm-hmm. the last people to put their hands up are juror number 11 and juror number 9.
Yep. And they're the ones who are, you know, and you watch that scene, and that's the whole group thing type mm-hmm. problem is, well, I don't actually know if I believe that, but well, there's 8 hands up. I might as well put my hand up too and just see what's going on here, because these are the louder people in the room. But as this movie starts to, you know, move on, you start to realize the loudest people in the room don't necessarily know what they're talking about. And that's how I feel a lot. I mean, I really do, like, for the most part, stay off of social media and such, but I'll do it for this podcast or for the Survivor podcast or any of that stuff, like when I have to. But you could blow up a lot of those people by just seeing them in person one time and saying, why do you feel that way? What don't you like about them? What do you like about them? They wouldn't be able to tell you, because they would just read off some point that they read, like you said, where you can easily refute either side of anything in literally a matter of seconds. I don't know what the hell is true anymore. I don't think anybody knows what the hell's true anymore. But this movie is telling you a conversation is probably going to lead to the truth better than just saying, oh, well, screw it. That guy's scary and he's got his hand up and he's a loudmouth. So I'm just going to agree with him because I don't want to have confrontation. Sometimes confrontation isn't actually a bad thing.
Yeah. Not when it's civil.
Yeah. So like I said, this movie was the top, or was lost to The Bridge on the River Kwai for the 3 Oscars it was nominated for. Somehow wasn't nominated for a single acting Oscar, which blows my friggin' mind because the acting in this is top notch. I don't think any of them would have beaten Alec Guinness for Bridge on the River Kwai because he's unbelievable, but maybe for supporting actor, I don't know. But this movie, AFI's top 100 movies, it was number 87. Juror number 8 was the number 28 hero of all time. 100 Years, 100 Cheers, number 42. AFI's top 10, it was rated the number 2 courtroom drama. And the one that cracks me up is a movie about 12 men, half of them who are old as shit, sitting in a room, was voted the 88th best, 88th most thrilling movie by the AFI Top 100. And I totally think it deserves, but I totally think that if you start thinking about thrills, there are thrills in this movie. But it's funny that it actually gets noticed for that kind of thing because, the number 1 movie on that was Psycho. Number 2 was Jaws. Mm-hmm. Those movies have nothing in common with 12 Angry Men.
No, but you're right. And it is a thrilling ride. And you sit down and you watch it and you're so engrossed. Yes, this is already a short film, but it goes by so quickly because you're just engrossed by where is it going to lead. You're always questioning, are they going to be able to convince everyone? Or is this going to be a hung jury?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I love how quickly people are, as soon as they start being disagreed with, it's just going to be a hung jury. You're never going to convince me, blah, blah, blah. People who don't want to be convinced are never going to be convinced. But can you present enough to make them look inside? I always say, I'll have a conversation with anybody about anything. You might try to change my mind. You might do it. You might not. I might change your mind. I might not. I don't care. But having you talk about it. And it's not saying that the only reason this conversation is useful is because Henry Fonda comes out of it being right and everybody agrees with him. No, it's not about you sit down and you got to convince 11 other people to see everything exactly your way. It's just a matter of, can you start to come closer to a middle ground so that you're not so vehemently opposed to each other? That's really what the message of this movie is, I think. Because by the end of it, none of them are sure. But that's enough to say he's not guilty. None of them being sure. That's okay. And it's okay to admit that you're not completely right, that you are unsure. I think that's ultimately what this movie's about, and it just friggin' works, man. It just works. So that's what I have about that. John, you have anything else you want to say about this movie here?
No, I think we covered it all. We covered its cultural relevance and its current relevance.
Yeah, there you go. So we covered everything there with that one. Next week, we're going to be talking about, as again I said, 2003, The Room by Tommy Wiseau, and 1961, La Notte, Michelangelo Antonioni, who's one of the most depressing directors out there. John, we did not draw it up this way, but man, we could not have drawn it up any better than the way that this is about to turn out, because it's crazy. It's crazy what we're about to do here. Talk about these two movies at the same time.
It is. And for those of you who haven't seen The Room, please watch it with someone else, because it's a movie you need to watch with someone. For those of you who have seen The Room, watch it with someone who hasn't seen The Room.
My question is, if you haven't seen The Room, where have you been living that you have not managed to see The Room yet? I mean, this has been out for almost 20 years now. The Disaster Artist came out. This is no longer a cult hit. This is like must-see viewing for any moviegoer ever now.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Absolutely.
I don't know.
And I'm very excited to talk about it next week.
Can't wait. This is going to be a fun conversation next week.
Yeah.
Not sure if we're going to be on Monday or Tuesday night next week. So keep following us on Twitter, the Survivor Specialist Twitter, because we'll be posting about it there. Probably going to be Tuesday, but not 100% sure yet, with it being Memorial Day here in the States and all of that. But anyway, Thank you all for listening. Hope you're enjoying this. Episode 19 next week. We are 2 weeks away from episode 20. And then actually we are going to take a week break because I'm going to be in Disney World. But yeah, so that's a good time to break. Like we're like just professional at planning this out here, John.
Yeah, of course.
But anyway, so hope you're all enjoying. That's all I got. Jay Millsip on Letterboxd. I'm Pwood43 on Letterboxd. We've been watching some good movies. Now it's starting to get to the point where I almost feel bad for Brief Encounter, because now I'm watching good movies all at the same time. But that's it. If you want to know what we're watching, check that out. Otherwise, The Room in La Notte next week. Oh,